All right, so I wanted to do a quick little video going over some of my recent studies and giving a little bit of insight and I guess some tips about studying in general, as well as I guess a technique or an approach that I've been doing recently in particular. And so I'm going to go over some of the stuff that I've been doing around about the last week chronologically, and I'm just going to give some of my thoughts about I think mostly mindset when it comes to studying. And this is the first thing that I've done after what must have been a couple months without any studying at all, I think. Not even, traditional sketching or anything like that. I was kind of slumped with work. So I was sort of coming back from, I guess you could say, a lack of conditioning. And so that's sort of the first thing that I think is helpful to think about and to look at when it comes to studying is you can get more conditioned to study more. And on top of that, I think you can also just, with experience and maybe even more importantly, with making it a habit, you can sort of psychologically experience it as less fatiguing or less of a deal. Like you can just jump into studies and not really have to pressure yourself. And that's kind of what I did here. And I did it intentionally with what is deep within the comfort zone for me, which is just portrait studies. And all of these aren't from photo reference. It's just random stuff I grab off of Pinterest. And here I'm sort of just, I guess, reiterating to myself, to my brain, I'm sort of telling it, hey, you can draw. This is sort of the level that you're at, and it's sort of on top of that, not really so important that you're exactly strict about how you draw either, and you can feel more comfortable working digitally here, because I've been in the last maybe half a year or so been I guess studying more traditionally. And so some of them I've done just with line like this, just using a single simple brush. And then some of the other ones, like this one here, I've done as a mixture of working with this kind of a grainy line art brush and a gradient set to dissolve, which is just a little kind of side tangent, but it creates this very crisp, perhaps a little jarring kind of grain texture, and it, I think, mixes well with my already grainy brush. And then here I have something sort of in between, and I think this is I guess the most freeing, or it feels the most organic to me, is when I draw something and then I actually start filling in values and actually begin painting in edges as if I was actually painting. And I think psychologically as well, that's helpful to sort of break down the barrier that we perceive between drawing and painting as these sort of two distinct things. And, whereas in reality, there's a lot of sort of overlap, and certain things like this, you can't really say whether they're, a drawing or a painting study. So this whole sheet here was really just me getting more comfortable, and there was no exact stated purpose to what I was doing here. I just wanted to kind of get warmed up and get back into it, and this is entirely fine. I think some people, and this is going to depend a lot on your kind of personality and your predisposition, but a lot of people will overanalyze things and they'll get paralyzed by analysis, and they won't even start actually working on anything, gathering volume, gathering mileage, because they're trying to create a system to work as optimally or as perfectly as possible. And there's certainly problems in the other end, which is what I'm going to talk about as we move forward here. But this is one of the coming sheets that I've done, and I usually work like this. Well, I just gather a couple of references and put them on a reference board, and I often will gather more than actually end up drawing, but I'll just start and then I'll keep expanding my canvas more and more until I eventually sort of am done. But I don't really pre-plan a composition. This is just one drawing that I did, and then I just did another one next to it. And this one I went into, I guess, the whole sheet really, but this drawing in particular, with the intent of sort of trying to mix this line art approach with a little more value, all sort of organically on the same layer. And this is sort of further towards and with the goal of getting more and more comfortable with the medium, not worrying about, like, I have a couple line art brushes. They're all kind of grainy, but I'm sort of moving through them lately as I've been doing the studies. I'm moving through them very arbitrarily, like it doesn't actually really matter. And sometimes I'll actually draw with this brush that I typically use for painting, and then I have a couple other sort of soft brushes, like you see here, that I typically apply by putting down, like you see here, for example, a lasso selection, and then sometimes I'll brush the value in, whether it's fully black, or sometimes I'll actually just get a brighter kind of gray tone, and sometimes I'll actually put it in with the gradient, and this tends to work really well for soft rendering. But this one, really, this first drawing was just about, you know, getting more free, I guess, loosening up further with the way that I put down lines and the way that I put down values. And then this one was just purely an exercise of just drawing something that I saw as kind of complex and difficult, because there's multiple figures in space interacting with each other, and it's approached a little differently. Like, it's certainly less organic, there's less going on. It's just kind of simple line art, a couple kind of inked blacks, I guess you could say, in some of these accented areas, and then just a little bit of kind of flat shadow added underneath, whereas all of this is sort of mixed together organically, and there's less of a separation between value and line. But this was sort of further kind of continuing on the first little sheet that I did, with the intent of just getting more and more used to studying and building the habit back up. And you'll find that if you have a habit and then you sort of drop off and you don't do it for a little while, it's a lot easier to build it back up. It's not really that much of a sort of resistance that you're facing when you rebuild something. But here, this is a lot more finished. It looks a lot more presentable. But that wasn't my purpose with this sheet when I started. My whole approach was exactly the same, although now, and you'll see this as a pattern as I go further and further, and I guess as I move in later and later into this studying block, which is typically how I go about studying in general, is I'll usually have these bursts of a couple weeks where I study more intensely, and then I'll drop off. Usually I'll take on too much work to even have enough time to study in the first place, but then I'll get back into it after a little while. So there's sort of these blocks that end up being pretty distinct, or although I don't really, you know, plan them or schedule them or anything like that, but typically I'll start with something vague, something sort of not something that doesn't pressure me really, and then I'll get sort of more and more serious with my intent. I'll get more and more specific, and I'll sort of start asking more and more of myself, I guess you could say that. So here, what I wanted to do was just exaggerate costumes, and so do full character drawings, but sort of push certain parts of the shape design. Like, for example, I oversized the sleeves here. I made the head a little smaller. I made this quite a bit longer, stuff like that. And I didn't know how many of these I was going to do. It really just depends on how much time I have in that particular day or how I'm really feeling. I don't really try to be meticulous with this. I rather just have it, you know, organic. And the most important thing is that I show up, and I have sort of a general approach that I can fit and sort of adjust based on how I'm feeling that day. And if the study session turns into a presentable, nice looking sheet like this, that's great. If it doesn't, that's fine either. That's fine also. It doesn't really matter so much. And so, you know, these two are very similar. I just try to exaggerate the shapes, but more and more as I got further and further into the session, I was sort of mixing the tools that I was using, adding a lot more value, and I guess in this drawing here, kind of rendering as well. So as you sort of recognize that studying is becoming a habit again, or if you don't have a habit of doing it in the first place, as you recognize that, you know, you have a streak going, then over time and gradually you can start introducing specific topics, or I guess specific parameters, specific criteria that you're sort of holding yourself to. And I think the best way to think about this is to have a clear intention for any kind of studying session that you do. And that intention, even though it's clear, doesn't necessarily need to be precise. So it's not as if for the first couple sessions I had something too precise. It was kind of vague, really. It was just about getting volume down and getting kind of warmed up, but then it can over time, and it probably should and generally does, become more and more specific, and because I'm pretty much just like mostly a character designer or a character illustrator, it's obviously going to be mostly character studies, and even more specifically, I guess, figure studies that you see here, that I'm showing. But here's a little thing that I've started doing, that I've realized is very, again, kind of freeing, and it's a low pressure approach. And I think that's very important, when it comes to getting yourself to do something that you typically wouldn't, something that you perceive as difficult or tedious or boring, like studying, is that you lower the barrier to entry as much as you possibly can. And people have, they often have this sort of the other way around. They think that, oh, I'm going to be so disciplined that I'm going to sort of make this as I said, optimized, but by extension as difficult on myself as possible, and I'm really going to use my my willpower to force myself into doing this, and to sort of work my way through it arduously. And although I think that's typically done with the good intention, more often than not, it tends to backfire, because there's the human factor that when you're idealizing like this, and when you're sort of creating these systems, you tend to overlook. And the reality is, you'll, more likely than not, if you make this more difficult on yourself, you'll just skip it altogether. So make it as easy as possible, and consider it not only as a daily thing, but also sort of think about how you can develop it over time across multiple weeks or months. And one of the ways that I found that helped me do this, and obviously I'm doing just sort of pretty standard classic standing figures here, and that's not random either, but I've just been doing them with this very big brush. Now, it doesn't really matter what brush you're using. I have this flat brush, and I kind of like it because it's hard edged. If I was using any of my other line art brushes, I think they would be a little too soft. So that's a part of the reason why I use it. Another part is that even though I have the rotation turned on, so I can sort of, as you can see, tilt it, I don't really actually do this when I draw quickly. So sometimes I'll get thick lines, and sometimes if I draw across this way, or if I turn my arm sort of randomly, I'll get thinner lines. So there's a bit of randomness that, while it seems kind of counterintuitive, actually helps me, because it takes some of the control away from me. So some lines will end up pretty thick, some will end up a little thinner, and that's kind of the point. The lines are approximations, and I've realized, to sort of circle back to the particular intent here, I've realized that, even though I mostly do characters, and a lot of the work that I do is just character sheets, so a bunch of drawings of really characters standing for the most part, I still felt a little uncomfortable sometimes drawing these standing poses, and I would need some reference, or maybe too much reference, I felt sometimes. And so I thought a good way to help this, and kind of fix this issue is, let's just do a lot of standing poses. Sort of obvious, and I don't know, I'm saying it like it's sort of quantum physics. Obviously, I'm going to do more standing poses, and over time, my visual library of standing poses is going to develop, and I'm going to get better at them, but even more specifically, I'm going to get faster, more effective, and more comfortable with them. But what I found is that if I draw with a very thin brush, I tend to get a little hung up on being precise, obviously, because the brush itself is small and precise. But that's not really where the issue lies for me, because usually when I do my drawings, I'll put clothes on top of my characters. Most character designs are not, naked or half-naked figures. Most of them have a full costume. So it's not as if I really need, if I'm trying to be very effective and very focused, I don't need to study this in surface detail. I need to study sort of mannequinized versions, but not mannequinized as in, precise, sort of built out, constructed, cylindrical or boxy versions, but rather more gestural, I guess, simplifications. And so that's why I started using this. And you might find this helpful for really just about anything, because in reality, even beside the fact that this is because I'll draw costumes on top of my figures, more often than not, when your drawing fails, it's not because the surface layer of rendering or detailing failed. It's because something fundamental was off, or perhaps because you messed up something fundamental later on. So I think the best way to sort of, I guess, build a good foundation is to work on not necessarily quick drawings, but drawings that establish the first pass as much as possible, because everything else depends naturally on the first pass as it comes after it and builds on top of it. So you can do this with just about any subject matter. I'll show a few more sheets of standing poses like this, but this is sort of the first time that I've done it, and it came about pretty intuitively and pretty naturally. I was like, I'm kind of brain dead right now. I don't really have the mental energy to focus so much. So let me just try and do it with a sort of almost like half drawn, half painted approach. And I found that it works really well, not only for, you know, the way that it frees you up to not have to be specific with exactly where your line is, but also eventually if you want to add value, it tends to lend itself well to that, because you don't have to resize or change brushes much. So that's sort of the first like specific I guess exercise that you can do, is do drawings with a tool that's oversized and perhaps a little unwieldy, so that you can actually sort of deter yourself from focusing on specifics and details. And of course, that's if that is your intention. If you want to work on more fundamental elements, here is another exercise which is actually, I guess, focused on the exact opposite, and that's the line art. And these are all Jung Gi tracings, I guess, and I've been doing this sort of sporadically as a bit of a warm-up here and there, where there's really not much to it. And a lot of this, I guess, is kind of sort of obvious, especially when I put it into words, but I don't think a lot of people do this. Is you just, you know, put a drawing underneath, lower its opacity, and then draw on top of it. And you can do this with you know, attempted consciousness. You can do this sort of thinking about it, and this is advisable, but you can also do it sort of completely relaxed as a way of really quickly warming up without having to worry about what you're gonna draw. So here I was trying to actually think about what I'm doing, and I'm also, apart from just tracing, which I think is even though it's kind of abstract and it's a little unclear why it helps, I think it's inherently helpful even if you're not being consciously analytical. But I was also doing these little drawings to the side where I was you know, taking the tracing and kind of doing a call out, trying to either simplify it a little bit or just repeat it. And I guess a lot of this does come down to repetition, but I'm leaving little notes as well, sort of trying to I guess point stuff out to myself, like, you know, this is wrapping, or this is not really so much about folds, but it's more about like wrinkled texture. Here I'm noting that this is like a big rib cage, and that all of the lines in the drapery are sort of pointing to that fact. So from there, I've also done a little work just tracing photos, but trying to sort of replicate the line art style. So there's a couple things going on within this very kind of constrained parameter of tracing Jung Gi. It's not only just tracing Jung Gi, it's tracing his sort of more, I guess, mechanical pencil or this thin liner drawing. So not so much the brushy stuff, but also focusing on drapery, and then eventually trying to apply that to photo reference. And this is obviously way easier than actually drawing, because you have everything pretty much solved for you. And if you're not trying to replicate a particular style of mark making or style of line art in this case, then really all you're doing is just sort of repeating. So this, I think, to sort of tie it back to the first part of the video, to what I was talking about earlier, this is a very good way of getting yourself back into drawing. And I think maybe especially if you have an art block or something like that, where you're like, man, I can't even put my my pen down and do anything at all. Very often doing something like this, especially if you're tracing other people's art, especially if you're tracing artists that you actually really like, this will kind of invigorate you, because you'll be like, man, I want to make something now that I've actually kind of in a weird sense made it over somebody else's drawing. So this builds a weird kind of muscle memory where you'll find yourself, I think, if you do this enough and over a long enough period of time, you'll find yourself making good marks without necessarily even you know, consciously knowing why, because you're just building I guess building sort of an experience of making a good drawing without actually, you know, making it yourself. So I guess give this a bit of a shot if you're trying to include something different, or if you're, I guess, fed up with the stuff that you've been studying, or maybe if you just haven't been studying at all. And obviously this shouldn't be the only or even the primary thing that you're doing, but maybe over time you can sort of see through experience whether it's worthwhile or not. But that's sort of the second little tip that I had, and from there I just want to show a few more examples. I think this is a very good sheet to sort of illustrate a fairly optimal study session, where here at the very beginning, and maybe it's a little upside down because I did end up doing some tracings at the very end. Maybe the better approach chronologically would be to do this early on, as a first thing to warm up. These are some Otto Schmidt drawings here, and I think I'll leave all of the artists in the description. This is Otto Schmidt, and this is Cory Loftis. I think that's how you pronounce it. Yeah, maybe do this first, and then I did some standing poses from reference again with this sort of chonky brush approach, which, like I said, lends itself really well to actually blocking in, and in a lot of cases here, inventing shadow shapes. So it's sort of a nice kind of synergetic approach to sort of the overall impression of the pose, not just specific line art, not specific construction, and not just shape either. It's sort of a mix of gesture, construction, and shape block in. So this bit is done from reference with certain poses, I guess, sort of getting little call outs as well. And then I did this little row here from invention, just trying to not necessarily only replicate what I've done here, although I do get sort of some similar poses in, like this knee forward kind of pose in a couple different iterations, but also just sort of get volume and just keep getting the reps in, really. And as I do that, keep getting more and more comfortable with it. So the goal isn't necessarily to do something grand, and it certainly isn't to have the effect look indistinguishable from reference, because it's a completely different thing. It's a different ballpark. It's really like a different skill that you're practicing and that you're applying when you do stuff from reference versus when you do stuff from invention. And this is something that I used to get hung up on a lot, is I was sort of misguided to think that, oh, I really want my drawings from invention to look like they're from reference. But obviously that's just counterintuitive. It doesn't really make sense, and it's kind of impossible as well. But in any case, I think this is a very good sort of two-step approach to studying just about anything. Again, I'm doing the same thing that I've been doing, standing poses, and make it applicable, make it practical, make it something that you'll actually use. And if you do that, you'll find that your mind is a lot more receptive to actually putting in effort, and to then also internalizing the information and being able to replicate it. If you're just doing something because you think you should, because you've been told that this is a fundamental that you ought to study, you'll find that often, regardless of your goodwill and your self-discipline or whatever it may be, you sort of I guess your heart's just not really in it. You can't really convince yourself to be interested in something. It's almost like studying for school for a subject that you really don't care about at all. As weird as it may seem, because obviously everybody that draws starts out especially because they are passionate about it. But make it specifically something that you'll use, like something that you've encountered an issue with, that you think if you get better at your actual art that you make, that you invent, that you put storytelling into, will get better. And this is a real motivator, because you want your art to get better, because you want to convey something with your art. So it's not as abstract. And again, you'll find that it's, for whatever reason, much easier. You get much more receptive that way. So anyway, reference going into invention, it's kind of a simple, obvious approach where some of the, I guess, aspects that you've studied in the reference will inevitably seep through in here, and you sort of solidify and reiterate the information that you've gathered here in the invented studies after the fact. So ideally, these would come right after the other chronologically, maybe in the same session, maybe in the same day, maybe in 2 days. It doesn't really matter exactly, but just sort of iterating or I guess alternating these two is a good idea. And something that I myself probably need to be better at, because I tend to study from reference way more. And a lot of the time when you study from reference, it just sort of comes in through one ear and out through the other, and it doesn't really stick as well as it could. Even if you're studying something that you are interested in, that you think you'll need, that is, practically applicable to your general art, or even like a particular painting that you're working on at the moment. And then from there, this is sort of a completely different intention. And it kind of goes back to what I was talking about regarding intentionality, is when you set out to do your studies, just know what it is that you want to do. And it doesn't necessarily, as I think people are often instructed to think, have to be about changing reference. A lot of the time, actually, I think it's worthwhile studying reference so you get better at transferring proportions, for example, because you need observational skills as well as inventive. It's not all about analysis. So the intention doesn't need to be about analyzing. It can be just about anything, and so long as you're conscious of it, even if it's not perhaps completely clear in your mind, or if you're not sure about it, as long as you're thinking about it, I think that's all that you really need. So you don't need to overanalyze, why am I doing this? But obviously these are done in a different way, and they're done here in this case with the intent of exaggerating both the poses and some of the shapes in the characters. So I guess it's probably kind of about storytelling, about making the reference more impactful, and finding good reference goes a long way in this particular intention, I guess. But I'm actually very happy with this, and the way that I've drawn these kind of reflects that intention, because I've blocked in the whole thing. And I think doing this in particular, studying acting like this, studying posing, or studying shapes, tends to work better if you have reference with multiple characters interacting, because there's actual acting to be done then, or done there, as opposed to just having a single character in a vacuum. But in any case, I blocked the whole thing in, and then I focused my intention on mainly the faces, or sometimes maybe a little more on the hands, as the important storytelling areas. So these are very distinct from these, and neither are superior to other inherently. It's just about what it is that you want to do, why it is that you're studying. And this whole video really could be sort of summed up and filtered down into this idea of having a clear idea of that. Although, like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that pressures you, that weighs on you too heavily. Like these here, as a completely different example, were done very much as just kind of a cool down, and not anything else. Like I wasn't putting crazy expectations on myself. I knew that I had like a half hour at most, and I just got a couple, like sort of in the very beginning of the video, I just got a couple references of something that I'm comfortable with, which are faces, and I just wanted to again use my broad brush to feel kind of less beholden to detail, and just put down big shapes that generally get the likeness across, and then just sort of enjoy and play around with a couple different tools, like using some smudging, a little bit of value, a little bit of gradients as well. So this is more painted, this is kind of more drawn. It doesn't really matter so much, and so you can always do this. You can always just sort of do whatever and just sort of fill up a page with little stuff. But I think ideally you'd get a balance, and you'd sort of think about it and be conscious of what is appropriate when. Like this was done at like 10 in the evening. I didn't have much brain power in me left. But if you have time in the morning and you want to get sort of a little more out of I guess, improvement out of your studies, then always think about why you're doing them. And here's another little example. All of these are Mateo Scalera, I think that's how you pronounce it, inks here. Let me actually just turn them on. But what I really liked about them are the poses, and this sort of goes kind of hand in hand with my standing poses arc here. I like the poses, but I also liked maybe even more specifically the shapes, and so it's sort of an intersection of those two that I've been studying here. Again, just sort of tracing the whole thing, in this case sometimes adding a little bit of value as well, because he does really good work sort of grouping values, but also just sort of shaping really nice kind of pools, especially of shadow, and then also doing little call outs as well. And I found that especially when you have an artist that you're studying that works in this kind of stylized or simplified way, what you're sort of given and what you're really looking to replicate are shorthands or sort of solutions to, you know, a way of drawing something, the problem of drawing, for example, feet here. And these tend to be very clear when the art is simplified, because simplification clarifies. And so they also, on top of that, tend to be kind of replicable or repeated. He has a way of drawing feet, the way of kind of creating this tapered shape, this asymmetrical, really nice organic shape that I like, that he does over and over, pretty much. And so I'll just draw it from on top of, you know, his drawing, but then from the drawing as well, a couple times over and over, and kind of try to, as much as I can, ingrain it in my mind, or even more specifically, I guess, ingrain it in my muscle memory. So that's a lot of what's going on in here. Nothing new or nothing crazy, but just sort of another example. Really just sort of, if anything, showing the repetitive nature of studying, and that's sort of par for the course, and it's sort of part of the games. You have to, over time, develop patience and realize that it's not going to be very exciting most of the time. It's not going to be, you know, necessarily even presentable, certainly not glamorous, but hopefully these couple tips and a few insights were at least interesting, if nothing, ideally, you know, helpful or even actionable, applicable for your studies immediately. If you have any thoughts on this, any questions, anything at all, feel free to leave those in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. If you like that video and you want to support my work, you can do so by subscribing to my Patreon, where for just $6 a month, you get access to more than 100 videos, both tutorials and process. And if you don't want to do that just yet, then you can also just check out this collection right here, the membership sneak peek, where there's a bit of a taster of what these videos look like exactly, and you can view this for free completely. So if you're interested in that, check it out via the link in the description.